Thanks for your company here on Saturday Agenda. I'm joined now by Parliamentary Secretary Alan Tudge in Melbourne, also the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Matt Thistlethwaite at the Sky News Centre, and Greens Senator Scott Ludlam at our Sydney CBD studio. Thank you all for joining us in this very important discussion. I'll start with you, Alan Tudge. The threat level in Britain, as we've seen today, has been raised to severe. It's unchanged here in Australia, but what does the government perceive the threat to be in Australia when it comes to radical Islam at this time? Can you outline that?
Yeah, the threat levels are still at medium level here in Australia. They have been since 2003, but the threats are real and they are serious. And I think the best way of describing how serious they are is by reference to the number of Australians that fought with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, in that instance, there were 30 Australians that went abroad, 25 came back, and of that 25, 18 were subsequently convicted of terrorism-related offences. Now, in this instance, we've got 60 Australians who are fighting with ISIS in Iraq and a further 100 Australians who are supporting them financially or through other operational measures. So the threat is very significant, it is real, we must stay on top of it, and the intelligence agencies have been giving us advice and we are acting upon that advice.
But Matt Thistlethwaite, we've seen three new faces on the front of the Australian newspaper today. Australians from the suburbs in cities like Brisbane and elsewhere who are thought to be now fighting for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now, Australian citizens have fought for both sides in Bosnia. They've regularly been fighting in Israel, for example. Now, completely different, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to compare those conflicts to what ISIS is trying to do. ISIS is obviously trying to set up a terrorist state. And do you perceive that to be a far greater risk, I suppose, to Australians here at home?
Well, David, in these sort of situations, I think it's very important that the government of the day accept the advice of the experts and the Australians who are working in this area to provide the government with the necessary intelligence on what's occurring with respect to Australians who do seek to go overseas and fight in conflicts such as this. We're confident that the Australian intelligence and security organisations are giving the appropriate advice to the government, and based on that, the government of the day sets the threat level. We've seen situations of Australians travelling overseas. The laws that we have in Australia to deal with that are in place, and that includes being able to cancel passports. When Labor was in government, we did that on the basis of the security and intelligence information that was being provided by our expert agencies, and I think it's appropriate that we don't unnecessarily alarm people and we make sure that we're acting on the expert advice, and that appears to be occurring at this point in time. It's also important that the government is briefing the opposition. Is there a suggestion
that there is unnecessary alarm that's being raised? Is that's not what you're saying, is it?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that that based on the expert advice of the security and intelligence organisations, the government sets the level of response, and it appears to be appropriate in this case.
Scott Ludlam, we've seen 2 Australians stopped at the border this week alone trying to leave this country. 5 have been intercepted in total on national security grounds in the last few weeks and months. It's likely that innocent Australian citizens are going to be caught up in this sort of net, if you like. Is that worth it, do you think, in order to actually keep this country safe?
Well, it depends what you mean. Is it worth it? I think we can consider ourselves fortunate that it's still people numbering in the low dozens. You can imagine what the Indonesian authorities are having to deal with, or even the scale of the problem of that issue in the United Kingdom at the moment. What it tells me, I suppose, is that the security framework and the laws that we have and the powers that the agencies have that are working overtime to either prevent people from leaving or from returning are working.
And what are your concerns at the moment with what the government is moving ahead with when it comes to fighting homegrown terrorism. I know that you're very concerned in particular about the collection of metadata.
Yeah, well, there are a few things. I mean, some of the government's law reform proposals at the moment just seem like terrible overkill. If you are tracking a few dozen, or maybe, I think James said perhaps up to 150 people who might be participating in these conflicts overseas, do you really need to roll a surveillance ruler over all 23 million Australians, or reverse profoundly important legal precedents like the burden of proof that have prevailed for hundreds of years? And that's where I think the government may be going a bit wrong.
The government has made clear. The government has made clear that onus of proof isn't reversing as such. There is a shifting of the burden of proof to an extent, but it's not a complete reversal, according to the Foreign Minister this week.
Map, and that maybe it's one that we'd best reserve our judgment on, because what we get are these sort of thought bubbles at press conferences and selective leaks to newspapers. On that one, we haven't seen a bill yet. We also haven't seen a bill on mandatory data retention. But for example, there is a bill with the Joint Intelligence Committee at the moment that proposes to, effectively criminalise journalism and allow what looks to us like unregulated surveillance of third-party computers. I think the case hasn't really been made that we need this vast expansion of the security apparatus on the basis of a few dozen people fighting in foreign wars. It appears to us, I guess, that the agencies actually have the measure of these people, and they're working as effectively as they can.
Alan Tudge, a few things to respond there. Has the government adequately made the case for, as Scott Ludlam described it, a mass expansion of our security surveillance, intelligence surveillance?
Well, I just want to make sure that we're clear exactly what we are doing and what we are not. Scott made the allegation that we're reversing the onus of proof, and we are not doing that. What we are doing is we are requiring Australians who wish to travel to northern Iraq, one of the most dangerous places in the world, which is presently governed by a terrorist organisation, which DFAT says do not go there. We are asking Australians who do want to go there to explain the reason why. Now, then it will be incumbent upon the security agencies to prove that their explanation is incorrect. So the onus of proof will still be upon the security agency. But I don't think it's unreasonable to ask Australians, if they are travelling to terrorist locations, to explain why they are proposing to travel there. Perhaps there is a good reason, but let's at least understand why.
And what about on metadata? We have gone over this some time ago on Sky News and for some time, but do you believe now that the government's case is solid, that people are starting to accept that the mass collection of metadata in the way it's been put forward in the most recent legislation isn't that different to what companies were already doing?
No, and that's exactly right, David. And let's be clear about this. We're collecting the metadata. We aren't collecting or proposing to collect the contents of people's phone calls or people's website visits. But let me explain how important this can be, and by reference to an example in 2008. In 2008, it was found that a single IP address was used for child exploitation purposes. Now, by the agencies being able to track that IP address, they were subsequently able to arrest 144 people on child exploitation. They were subsequently able to remove 440,000 images, and were able to save the lives of 4 innocent children. And that was because they had that one piece of data. So that gives an example of exactly how powerful being able to access those small pieces of data can be.
I'll get a response from you, Scott Ludlam, before I go to Matt Thistlethwaite, just to that specific comment on metadata there.
Sure. I think what that showed us is that 6 years ago, under existing powers with existing technology, they were able to solve crimes without warrantless metadata capture of the entire Australian population. I don't have any problem at all with using these categories of material to track down criminals, the work that the anti-corruption agencies do, or for national security. It's just that we are reversing decades of legal precedent that say that these things should be discriminate, you should be targeting serious crime, and you should get a warrant. You should have judicial oversight. And it's this huge expansion of metadata capture, none of it being accessed with a warrant by dozens of agencies that have nothing whatsoever to do with anti-corruption or national security. No, that's so concerning.
But again, you're misleading the Australian public there, Scott. I mean, so this information generally is being collected already, and the legislation requires it to be held for a couple of years, and for very good reasons. And I gave an example in the child exploitation case there. Now, warrants are still required, Scott. I think, as you know,
they're not.
If any content is desired by intelligence agencies. For example, the web page content, or, for example, any telephone content. Now, a formal warrant is required to be able to access that if that data still is indeed kept.
So do you not think that it's somewhat invasive to be able to track people's phones around the landscape without a warrant?
I want to get Matt Thistlethwaite's view on this. What is Labor's position now when it comes to metadata? Labor's been critical of the way it's been sold by the government, but broadly the opposition is still supportive of the government here, isn't it?
Well, David, there's still a lot of details that we haven't seen in respect of how this proposed law would operate, and we've said that we'll give these laws serious consideration, but we need to see the details. For instance, would a law like this apply to social networking platforms, instant messaging platforms? Who's going to pay for the cost of installing and setting up this law? I understand that the estimate is in the vicinity of $70 million to set up the necessary protocols, and an ongoing cost of between $1 and $2 million per year for providers. Who's going to pay that cost? These are the necessary details that we need to see before we can make a considered opinion on these laws.
Matt Thistlethwaite, I want to ask you about community engagement. Look, I have to move on because a couple of other things, and we're running fast out of time. Community engagement, Matt Thistlethwaite. The government did remove some funding for this in the budget. It's now returned it with a few additional $1 million. One Coalition MP said to me this week, it's very important that the government gets the message right when it comes to the Australian Muslim community, or we could be facing another Cronulla riot. Now, that wasn't too far from your neck of the woods. What's your feeling on the ground when it comes to Australians' feelings towards what the government is doing in relation to community engagement?
Well, we support what the government's done. In fact, it's Labor's view that they should have never ever cut that $9.7 million that was put in the budget by Labor. That program came about as a result of Labor's Countering Terrorism white paper. It was a recommendation of that. We put in place that program to counter violent extremism within community groups. It was a $9.7 million program. It was cut by the budget. In the budget by the government. Thankfully, they've woken up to themselves, just as they have woken up to themselves on 18C. If you're going to create a Team Australia, as Tony Abbott says he wants to, you can't be allowing your Attorney General to be going around saying that people have the right to be bigots. I hope that the government would take this on board and see this in respect of a couple of other budget measures, that they wake up to themselves in respect of Medicare and pensions and student fees.
Let's not get to the budget. We've only got a minute left. We've run rapidly out of time, I'm sorry. I want to get just 30 seconds from you, Alan Tudge, and then Scott Ludlam on Team Australia, on community engagement. Is Team Australia the right way to go?
David, we're targeting extremism, not any particular group. And we've got money on the table to support the prevention of homegrown terrorism, $64 million. People are unfortunately being radicalised in Australia. People aren't born radicalised. It is occurring in occasions in our suburbs. We want to engage with local people on the ground to address that at its source.
Scott Ludlam, is Team Australia the right message to give from the government?
Now, I find the whole concept a bit embarrassing, because nobody has done more to undermine the values that most of us hold most dear about our country than Tony Abbott. So if there's to be a Team Australia, I think a lot of people would rather that somebody else got to be captain for a while.
OK, we're right out of time. But we do appreciate the three of you joining us here on Saturday Agenda: Scott Ludlam, Matt Thistlethwaite and Alan Tudge. Thank you very much for your company.
Cheers,
and thanks
David.
for your company at home. I'm David Lipson. The news is up next.